Please, sir. I wasn't doing anything wrong, Imani Green sobbed, her voice trembling as she knelt on the cold grass. Her hands shook as she raised them in surrender. I just got lost, I swear. I live nearby. Please don't hurt me. Officer Daniel Graves stood over her, his gun aimed squarely at her chest. His cold blue eyes narrowed as a cruel smirk spread across his face. Shut up, he barked, stepping closer, the crunch of his boots on the gravel loud in the stillness of the night. I don't care what you have to say. You don't belong here, you hear me? Imani's breath hitched, her tears falling freely now. Please, I'm just trying to get home. I didn't mean to any harm. Graves leaned in, cutting her off sharply. Maybe this will teach your likes, and you all can finally go back to your country. Imani's heart pounded against her ribs, her voice breaking as she whispered, Please, I'm begging you. Graves tilted his head, his smirk hardening into a sneer. There was no hesitation, no pause, as his finger tightened on the trigger. The gunshot shattered the silence of the night. Imani's body jerked, and she crumpled to the ground, her cries replaced by the stillness of the air. As Graves stood over her for a moment, lowering his gun. Maybe next time, you'll learn to stay where you belong, he muttered under his breath. After Officer Graves shot Imani, the yard grew silent again. The only sound one could hear was the faint rustling of the wind through the trees. Graves turned and walked back to his patrol car, his steps deliberate and unhurried. He didn't look back, his shadow disappearing into the stillness as the headlights of his car flared to life. Imani lay motionless on the ground, the life she had once dreamed of slipping further from her grasp. The cold night enveloped her, the distant hum of the car fading into silence. Meanwhile, her family was back home oblivious of what had happened to her. As Imani lay almost lifeless on the grass, her mind went back to hours ago when she was with her family. If only she had listened to her father and stayed back home. Where are you watching this story from? Let us know in the comments. And if you believe that all people deserve to be treated with respect and regard, no matter the color of their skin, subscribe to this channel. How did Imani end up here? Why did this cop shoot her? How did Imani end up in this situation? I know that these are the many questions running through your mind right now, and to understand all of these, we have to go back to the beginning, to where it all started, to Imani's roots. One evening, before the tragic incident, the Green household buzzed with the warmth of a close-knit family. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows, casting a golden glow over the coffee table. Seated around it were General Marcus Green, his wife Cynthia, and their 17-year-old daughter, Imani. Imani sat with her arms crossed, a playful smirk on her face as she debated passionately with her father about the fairness of curfews. It's not about me staying out late, Dad, she argued. It's about trust. Don't you think I've earned some independence by now? Marcus chuckled, shaking his head. Imani, you can argue your way out of anything, can't you? I don't know if I'm raising a daughter or a lawyer. She's definitely a lawyer, Imani's mom chimed in, her voice teasing. She's been practicing since she was 5, remember? Always finding loopholes in house rules. Imani grinned, reaching for a piece of toast. Well, it's good practice for when I'm a civil rights attorney. The room filled with laughter, the kind of light-hearted joy that felt unshakable. If only they knew about the tragedy that awaited them in a couple of hours. But as the conversation slowed, General Marcus's expression grew serious. Imani, he said, his tone soft but firm, you know we're proud of you. You're smart, strong, and you have a good heart. But the world, it doesn't always see that, especially for Black people like us. Imani's mom nodded, reaching out to squeeze Imani's hand. We just want you to be safe, baby. Stay aware of your surroundings. If anything feels wrong, call us. Promise? Imani's smile faded slightly and she nodded. I promise. But you don't have to worry so much. I'll be fine. Marcus exchanged a glance with Imani's, a flicker of concern passing between them. We know you will, sweetheart, Marcus said, his voice warm but heavy with meaning. It was almost as though their gut was warning them of what was to come, if only they had listened. but they didn't. So as breakfast wrapped up, Imani grabbed her bag and kissed her parents goodbye. "I'm going for a jog before dinner," she called out. "Be careful," they called after her. "I will," Imani replied with a wave, her voice confident as she stepped out into the bright afternoon. Inside the house, Marcus watched her go, a faint unease lingering in his chest. He shook it off, convinced that his daughter would return home, safe and sound. She did not, because that would be the last time they both saw their daughter healthy and in good shape. As Imani jogged, the sun hung low in the sky, painting the neighborhood in soft shades of orange and pink. Imani jogged along the quiet streets, her headphones playing a playlist of upbeat songs to keep her pace steady. She loved this time of day, the cool breeze brushing against her face, the rhythmic sound of her sneakers hitting the pavement, and the way the world seemed to slow down just before nightfall. She glanced at her watch. "Almost dinner time," she muttered to herself. Picking up her pace, she scanned the area for a way to shave a few minutes off her route. Her eyes landed on a narrow path that led into a wooded area. It wasn't a path she usually took, but she'd heard it connected to the main road on the other side. Shortcut, she thought, stepping onto the dirt trail. The woods were quiet, the sound of birds chirping blending with the faint hum of her music. She felt a slight unease as the trees grew thicker, but she shook it off. "It's just a shortcut," she reassured herself. She should have turned back. She ignored her instincts and marched forward. The path opened into a grassy yard surrounded by a low fence. Imani slowed her jog, glancing around. The area seemed empty, with no signs of anyone nearby. She didn't see the faded private property sign nailed to a tree near the entrance. The yard looked well kept, with a small shed in the distance and a gravel driveway leading toward the main road. Imani felt a wave of relief, thinking she was almost home. Unbeknownst to her, a patrol car sat parked just beyond the property's edge. Inside, Officer Daniel Graves sat sipping his coffee, his eyes scanning the area out of habit. When he spotted Imani jogging through the yard, his expression shifted. "Now what do we have here?" he muttered, setting his coffee down and grabbing his radio. He stepped out of the car, his hand resting on his holster as he began walking toward her. Imani didn't notice him at first, her focus on her music in the driveway ahead, but the crunch of boots on gravel made her stop and turn. "Hey, what do you think you're doing here?" Graves called out, his voice sharp and accusatory. Imani froze as Officer Graves marched toward her, his boots crunching loudly against the gravel. His hand rested on the gun holstered at his hip, his face set in a hard glare. "Stop right there!" Graves barked, his voice sharp and commanding. Imani raised her hands instinctively, her heart pounding. "I'm sorry," she said quickly, her voice trembling. "I hope I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just trying to get home." Graves narrowed his eyes, his tone dripping with disdain. "Home? What are you doing out here, running through someone else's yard? You think you can just wander wherever you please?" "I didn't mean to," Imani said, her voice cracking under the weight of his hostility. "I thought this was a shortcut. I live nearby, I swear. Please, I'll leave right now." Graves stepped closer, his hand tightening on his holster. "Nearby, huh?" he said, his tone mocking. "You don't belong here. You're one of those troublemakers, aren't you? Or a spy?" Imani shook her head quickly, her eyes wide with fear. "No, I'm not. Please, I'm not doing anything wrong. I just got lost, that's all." "Lost?" Graves sneered, his lips curling into a smirk. Imani's voice faltered as she tried to stay calm. "I'm not here to cause any trouble, I promise." Graves ignored her, his voice growing louder. "Shut up and get on your knees." Imani hesitated, her body trembling. "Please, sir, I said get on your knees!" Graves shouted, drawing his gun. Her legs gave way, and she dropped to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "Please don't hurt me," she begged, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm just trying to get home." Graves loomed over her, his gun aimed directly at her chest. His eyes were cold, devoid of any empathy. "People like you," he spat, "need to learn your place." Imani sobbed, her hands raised in surrender, her voice breaking as she pleaded, but her words fell on deaf ears. The scene faded as the sound of the gunshot shattered the night. The night air was heavy with silence, broken only by the crackle of Officer Graves' radio. He stood over Imani's motionless body, his gun still drawn, his face devoid of remorse. Her blood stained the grass beneath her, a stark contrast to the darkness surrounding them. He holstered his gun and stood with his arms crossed, pacing slowly as if the situation were routine. In the distance, the faint wail of sirens grew louder. Within minutes, 2 patrol cars pulled up, their red and blue lights flashing against the trees. 2 officers, Henderson and Carter, stepped out and approached Graves. "What happened here?" Henderson asked, his eyes glancing at Imani's body on the ground. Graves shrugged. "Caught her trespassing. She wouldn't listen and kept resisting. I had no choice." Henderson nodded without questioning him. "Got it. We'll secure the area." Carter glanced down at Imani, his expression faltering for a moment. "She looks young," he muttered almost to himself. "She was a threat," Graves snapped, his tone sharp. "She left me no choice." Paramedics arrived moments later, rushing to Imani's side. One of them, a woman in her 30s, checked for a pulse. "She's alive, but barely," she said urgently. "We need to move her now." The medics worked quickly, stabilizing Imani as best they could before loading her onto a stretcher. Blood soaked through the gauze as they pressed to her wound. Her face was pale, her breaths shallow. As the ambulance sped away, Carter hesitated. "Graves, are you sure?" "I'm sure," Graves interrupted, his voice firm. "Write the report as I said. She was trespassing and refused to comply. That's all there is to it." Henderson nodded again, patting Carter on the shoulder. "Let's wrap this up." As the patrol cars and officers left the scene, the grass remained stained with blood, the air still thick with tension. Imani's life hung by a thread, and the truth of what had happened remained buried under Graves' lies. The clock on the wall read just past midnight. General Marcus Green sat in the living room, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he flipped through a stack of documents. The house was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of papers. His wife, Cynthia, was pacing up and down. Imani had not come back home. They were both worried. The sudden ring of his phone shattered the stillness. Marcus frowned, picking it up quickly. A call this late rarely brought good news. "General Green speaking," he said, his tone calm and steady. "General Green, this is Dr. Reynolds from Memorial Hospital," came the voice on the other end. It was measured but carried a weight that made Marcus's heart tighten. "Yes, doctor, what is this about?" There was a brief pause before the doctor spoke again. "Sir, your daughter, Imani, has been admitted to the hospital. She's in a critical condition." Marcus froze, the words hitting him like a blow to the chest. "Critical condition? What happened?" "She was brought in with a gunshot wound," the doctor said carefully. "She's currently in a coma, and the injuries to her brain are severe. We've done everything we can to stabilize her, but the prognosis is uncertain." The phone nearly slipped from Marcus's hand. His breathing grew shallow as his mind raced. "A gunshot wound?" he repeated, his voice trembling with disbelief. "Yes, sir," the doctor confirmed. "The police reported it as an incident of trespassing, but right now, our priority is keeping her alive." Marcus hung up without another word, his hands shaking. He stood motionless for a moment before looking up at his wife, who was already breaking into hysteria. "Marcus, what's wrong? Who was shot?" she asked, her voice cracked. "It's Imani," he said, his voice breaking. "She's been shot. She's in a coma." Cynthia gasped, her hand flying to her mouth as tears welled up in her eyes. No, not our baby," she sobbed, her body shaking with grief. Marcus wrapped his arms around her, his jaw tight, his mind already planning his next move. "I'll find out what happened," he said firmly, "and whoever did this will pay." In their dilemma and confusion, they got into their car and drove to the hospital. When they got to the hospital, they were led by a nurse to where Imani was. The hospital room was eerily quiet, save for the steady beeping of the machines keeping Imani alive. The fluorescent lights cast a harsh glow on her pale face, her small frame almost swallowed by the hospital bed. Tubes and wires surrounded her, the ventilator hissing softly with each forced breath. General Marcus Green and his wife Cynthia stood at the foot of the bed, their eyes fixed on their daughter. Cynthia clutched Marcus's arm tightly, her face streaked with silent tears. Marcus, usually stoic and unshakable, looked as though the weight of the world was pressing down on his shoulders. Dr. Reynolds entered the room, his expression grim. He nodded at them gently before speaking. "Mr. and Mrs. Green, I'm so sorry to have to tell you this. Imani's condition is critical. The bullet caused significant damage to her heart, and her brain was deprived of oxygen for too long. We were able to get the bullet out, but she's currently brain dead and on life support. We expect that she would make a full recovery, but her chances are quite slim." Cynthia let out a sharp sob, her knees buckling. Marcus caught her, holding her close as she cried against his chest. He stared at the doctor, his voice low and strained. "What does that mean for her?" The doctor's eyes softened. "It means she's unlikely to recover. We're doing everything we can, but, like I said, the chances of her waking up are very slim. I wish I had better news." Marcus's jaw clenched, and he nodded curtly, struggling to maintain his composure. "Thank you, doctor," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. After the doctor left, Marcus guided Cynthia to a chair in the corner of the room, then pulled up a chair beside Imani's bed. He sat down slowly, his broad shoulders hunched as he took her hand in his. Her fingers were cold, lifeless, but he held on tightly. "Imani, my poor baby," he said softly, his voice cracking for the first time. "I'm so sorry this happened to you." He bowed his head, his military composure crumbling as tears slid silently down his face. "You didn't deserve this," he whispered. "None of it. But I promise you, I will make this right. I will find out who did this and I will make them pay." Cynthia watched from the corner, her sobs quieting as she saw the rare vulnerability in her husband. Together, they sat in the cold, sterile room, their hearts shattered, clinging to the faintest glimmer of hope. They spent the night beside her, crying and praying, hoping that by morning the doctor would have some better news. But nothing changed by morning. Instead, the morning after the shooting, the neighborhood buzzed with whispers and shock. News vans lined the streets near the hospital, their bright lights and cameras pointed at the building. Reporters crowded the entrance, waiting for any updates about Imani Green, the 17-year-old black girl who had been shot by a white police officer. The headline broke nationally within hours. Army General's daughter shot by police in alleged trespassing incident. News anchors delivered updates with somber tones detailing Imani's critical condition and the circumstances surrounding the shooting. By midday, protests began forming outside the police station. Dozens of people gathered, holding signs that read, "Justice for Imani," "End Police Brutality," and "Black Lives Matter." The crowd grew quickly, fueled by anger, grief, and a shared sense of injustice. Social media erupted, with hashtags like "Justice for Imani" and "Stop Police Violence" trending worldwide. Videos of the protests flooded timelines, showing people chanting and demanding accountability. Some clips even captured emotional speeches from neighbors and activists. "This isn't just about one girl," a community leader said into a megaphone. "This is about every black child who's been treated as less than human. We're here to say enough is enough." If you are watching this now and you would like to say enough is enough and offer your voice for Imani and many others who have had to face police brutality and racial bias, hit the subscribe button to show your support and comment "Enough is enough" so this can reach more people. Like and share with your friends and family. Back to the story. At the heart of the neighborhood, neighbors who knew Imani spoke to reporters, painting a picture of a bright, kind-hearted young woman with dreams of making the world a better place. "She's not some criminal," one neighbor said, visibly upset. "She's a good girl from a good family, and now she's fighting for her life because someone couldn't see past her skin color." The protests continued into the night, with people demanding answers from the police department. Inside the precinct, tensions ran high as officers scrambled to control the narrative. Officer Graves, now learning that the helpless child he had shot the day before was a general's daughter, started to make plans for his defense. He knew he was up against something big. Regret gnawed at him. However, he showed no signs of remorse and dismissed the growing outrage. "They're making a big deal out of nothing," he told a colleague. "She was trespassing. I did my job." But outside, the city was awake and alive with fury. The people weren't going to let this incident be swept under the rug. The name Imani Green became a rallying cry for justice, her story resonating with those who had endured similar pain and prejudice. The battle for the truth had just begun. General Marcus left his wife by Imani's side. He had to be a man and fight for his family, even though all he wanted to do was sit by Imani's side. So with all the hurt and anger in his heart, he left the hospital and headed to the precinct. The precinct was tense when General Marcus Green walked through the doors. His presence commanded immediate attention. Tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in his military uniform, he exuded authority. Officers and staff turned to look, some whispering nervously as he strode toward the front desk. "I'm here to speak with the chief of police," Marcus said firmly, his voice leaving no room for argument. The desk sergeant hesitated for a moment before nodding. "Right this way, sir." Moments later, Marcus was ushered into Chief Wallace's office. The chief, a man in his early 60s with a weathered face, stood to greet him, extending a hand. "General Green, I wish we were meeting under better circumstances. Please have a seat." Marcus ignored the gesture and remained standing, his eyes cold and steady. "I'm not here for pleasantries, Chief. I'm here to get answers about what happened to my daughter." Chief Wallace sighed and sat back down. "It's a tragic situation, General, but from the initial report, it appears your daughter was trespassing on private property." Officer Graves responded as he was trained to do. Marcus's jaw tightened. "My daughter is lying in a hospital bed, brain dead, because one of your officers decided she didn't deserve the benefit of the doubt. Trespassing doesn't justify shooting an unarmed 17-year-old girl." The chief held up his hands in a placating gesture. "General, I assure you, the department is conducting a full review." Officer Graves followed protocol. "Protocol?" Marcus interrupted, his voice rising. "Does protocol include shooting her point blank when she was no threat and unarmed? What are you even saying? Are you going to defend this? I can't believe what I am hearing right now." The chief shifted uncomfortably. "We'll need to look into that, but until then—" "I want to see the body cam footage," Marcus demanded, his voice firm and unyielding. Wallace hesitated, his eyes narrowing slightly. "The footage is part of an active investigation. I'm not sure." "I don't care about your excuses," Marcus snapped, leaning forward. "That footage will tell us what happened that evening. And if you don't release it, I will take this. I will bring down this station and everyone in it." Reluctantly, Wallace nodded. "Fine, we'll review it together." Marcus's expression didn't waver. "Show me." General Marcus was led to a conference room that was dimly lit, the tension palpable as he sat at the long table, his broad shoulders squared but rigid. Chief Wallace sat across from him, flanked by two officers operating the computer. A large screen on the wall displayed the paused opening frame of the body cam footage of that unfortunate evening. "Let's begin," Wallace stoned hesitant. The officer hit play, and the grainy footage came to life. Graves's patrol car came into view first, parked along the edge of the wooded property. General Marcus's jaw tightened, his fists clenching on the table. They watched in deafening silence the events of that fateful evening. On the screen, Imani took a cautious step back, her hands still raised. The footage captured Graves pulling his gun, pointing it at her chest, and then the screen froze as Graves raised his gun, and then the fatal gunshot. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the computer. Marcus's hands trembled as he gripped the edge of the table, his face dark with fury. His military composure cracked as his voice shook. That man, he said slowly, his tone deadly, looked at my daughter and saw nothing but his hate. This wasn't protocol. This was murder, and you all know it. No one in the room dared to speak as General Marcus rose, his determination burning through his grief. He called for Officer Daniels' arrest, and hours later Officer Daniels was in an interrogation room. The interrogation room was cold and sterile, the walls a dull gray. Officer Daniel Graves sat at the small metal table, leaning back in his chair with a smug expression. His arms were crossed, and his demeanor radiated arrogance. Across from him sat General Marcus Green, his piercing gaze fixed on the man who had nearly destroyed his family. Graves smirked as Marcus leaned forward, his fists clenched on the table. "You shot my daughter," Marcus said, his voice low but laced with barely contained fury. "An unarmed, innocent 17-year-old girl." Graves shrugged, his tone dismissive. "She was on private property. She shouldn't have been there in the first place. If she'd listened to me, none of this would have happened." Marcus's jaw tightened, but he kept his composure. "You did this to her, to my family, because of the hate you carry in your heart for my people. She begged you for mercy, and you shot her anyway. Why?" Graves leaned forward slightly, his smirk growing. "She was on private property. I had every right to detain her. When people resist, bad things happen. Maybe her daddy should have taught her to respect authority." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut, but he refused to let Graves see him falter. "You think this is over?" Marcus's voice was steady, but his eyes burned with rage. "You made a choice that night, a choice to let your hate control you, and you will face the consequences. You will pay for what you did to my child, my only child, my family." Graves chuckled, shaking his head. "What are you going to do? Wave your medals around? This isn't the army, General. This is the real world, and I know my rights." General Marcus stood slowly, his towering presence casting a shadow over Graves. "You're right. This is the real world, and in the real world, actions have consequences." Graves's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "Good luck with that." Not long after that encounter, barely 6 days later, Officer Graves' hearing took place. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the trial of Officer Daniel Graves began. Every seat was filled, and cameras from national news outlets lined the back wall. Graves sat at the defense table, his expression stoic, while his lawyer whispered in his ear. Across the room, General Marcus Green sat with his wife, Cynthia, their faces drawn but determined. The weight of the moment was heavy, but they were there to fight for their daughter. Witnesses took the stand one by one. Neighbors spoke about Imani's kindness, her bright future, and her dreams of becoming a civil rights attorney. "She was always helping others," one neighbor said tearfully. "She volunteered at community events, tutored kids in the neighborhood. She had such a big heart." The prosecutor played the body cam footage next. The courtroom was silent as the jury watched Graves's cruel words and actions unfold. Gasps filled the room when the gunshot echoed through the speakers, followed by Imani's lifeless body hitting the ground. Cynthia sobbed quietly, clutching Marcus's hand as the footage ended. The jury's faces reflected a mix of shock and disgust. When it was Marcus's turn to testify, he spoke with controlled emotion, his military composure holding steady. "Imani was my daughter," he said firmly. "She was intelligent, compassionate, and full of life. She was unarmed, no threat to anyone. I have never seen a situation like this, only in the movies. It is a shame that in 2025, an officer of the law can shoot at an unarmed teenager in the street, like she were some dog, and there would still be people defending such an act. Imani needs justice. She needs it today." Graves's lawyer attempted to paint the incident as a justified response to trespassing, but the prosecutor dismantled the argument, pointing out the excessive force and racist comments captured on tape. As the trial progressed, the evidence stacked heavily against Graves. The courtroom became a stage for a much larger conversation about systemic racism and accountability. The world was watching, and the fight for justice was far from over. Amidst court proceedings and their regular daily life, the Green family visited the hospital to be by Imani's side every day. Imani lay still in the hospital bed, her face pale, her chest rising and falling only with the help of the ventilator. Her mother, Cynthia Green, would sit beside her daughter, holding Imani's hand gently in hers. Her condition remained the same, but the family held on to the small hope that one day Imani might open her eyes and return to them. On the day the verdict was to be read, the courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension. Every eye was on the judge as he entered the room, taking his seat at the bench. Graves sat at the defense table, his face pale but expressionless. General Green sat with Cynthia in the front row, their hands clasped tightly together. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable, as the foreperson stood. The judge turned to the jury. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The foreperson nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. We find the defendant Daniel Graves guilty on all charges." The courtroom erupted in applause and cheers, tears streaming down Cynthia's face as she clung to Marcus. For the first time in weeks, she felt the weight on her chest begin to lift. Graves sat motionless, his smirk finally replaced with a blank stare as the reality of his actions settled in. Marcus stood, his face set with a mix of relief and sorrow. Justice had been served, but his daughter's future still hung in the balance. For now, though, the world had heard their voices, and they had won. The room was packed with reporters and community leaders, cameras flashing as General Marcus Green stepped up to the podium. His voice was steady, but his eyes held the weight of a father's grief. "My daughter Imani was not just a victim of one officer's hatred," he began, his voice firm. "She was a victim of a system that allows prejudice to thrive unchecked. Her story is not unique. It represents countless lives impacted by racial bias in law enforcement." He paused, his gaze sweeping the crowd. "This is a call for change. We must demand accountability, transparency, and reform to ensure that no family suffers what mine has. This fight isn't just for Imani, it's for every life cut short by injustice." Outside the conference, protesters chanted Imani's name, their signs reading, "Justice is just the beginning." Inspired by her story, a movement had begun. The screen shifts to a montage, crowds marching in the streets, holding signs that read, "Justice for Imani" and "End police brutality." Community leaders deliver speeches demanding systemic change. In another clip, lawmakers meet to discuss new policies aimed at addressing racial bias in law enforcement. Imani's story is a tragedy that never should have happened. It is a stark reminder of the cost of prejudice and the lives it destroys. But it is also a call to action, a call to demand accountability and fight for a system that treats every person with dignity and fairness. Change starts with awareness, and it starts with us. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for more heartwarming stories like these. The end.